In the Cold War era of the late 1940s, early 1950s, when Soviet Russia and the United States were having intense conflicts, nuclear weapon usage was a constant fear on people's minds. The threat of a nuclear holocaust was nonstop, and America refused to compromise with the Soviet demands. As a result, the U.S. established the Strategic Air Command, a nuclear deterrent in charge of nuclear strategy, Cold War command, and ballistic missiles. After the Cold War, SAC's impact on the U.S. stayed behind once they were disbanded, handing off its responsibilities to the U.S. Air Force in 1947. It is a well-known fact that Russia and the United States never got along. The hostility originally started during World War I. The United States opposed to Russia withdrawing from World War I and were opposed to their communist ideals. There were no diplomatic relations until 1933, but by that time Joseph Stalin was a totalitarian in power of the Soviet side, making it near impossible for any positive relations with the West. Although during World War II, the two countries did make alliance in the common aim of taking down Nazi Germany, the Soviets' aggressive anti-democratic policies created tensions between the two even before the war had ended. The Soviets long resented the U.S. for their refusal to accept them as a part of the international community, as well as America's delayed entrance into World War II, which they believed to be the cause of thousands of Russian deaths. America's foreign policy ideas in 1947 greatly impacted how we treated the Soviets. It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by outside pressures. President Harry Truman, 1947. Due to that foreign policy, the containment strategy was made, which was the idea that America had a role to play in stopping Russian expansion. The containment strategy gave Americans a rationale for unprecedented arms buildup, specifically of nuclear weapons. The world's first nuclear weapons explosion on July 16, 1945 in New Mexico, when the United States tested its first nuclear bomb. Not 3 weeks later, the world changed. Asia Society, 2014. There are two types of nuclear bombs: atomic, caused by nuclear fission, and hydrogen, caused by nuclear fusion. The best way to describe these blasts is through kilotons and megatons. For example, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Japan in 1945 released 15 kilotons, or 15,000 tons of energy from its chemical blast. At first, nuclear bombs were delivered by aircraft. Later, more efficient warheads called ballistic missiles were developed, which are now the most important and most used of nuclear weapons. Smaller tactical nuclear weapons have also been developed, including ones for artillery projectiles, landmines, anti-submarine depth charges, torpedoes, and shorter-range ballistics and cruise missiles. The Cold War was the biggest pushing factor for the creation of nuclear weapons. America greatly encouraged atomic weapon use against the Soviets, and so the arms race began. Who could get the best nuclear bomb first? Who would destroy who first? The stakes of the war were high. American stockpile of nuclear weapons reached its highest in 1966. The U.S. had more than 32,000 nuclear warheads, and over 30 different types. After the Cold War, many nuclear weapons were retired and dismantled to comply with the new arms control negotiations. By 2010, the United States had approximately 9,400 warheads of 9 types, including 2 types of bombs, 3 types of intercontinental ballistic missiles, 2 types of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and 2 types for cruise missiles. Some types existed in several modifications. Of these 9,400 warheads, an estimated 2,468 were operational. The rest were either spares held in reserve or retired warheads scheduled to be dismantled. Of the 2,468 operational warheads, approximately 1,968 were deployed on strategic, long-range delivery systems, and some 500 were deployed on non-strategic, short-range systems. Of the 500 non-strategic warheads in the U.S. arsenal, about 200 were deployed in Europe. With the use of world-destroying weapons, the American public was on edge with the constant threat of complete annihilation. After seeing the damage that the Hiroshima nuclear bomb caused, many people were concerned about the use of nuclear weapons. People were building bomb shelters in their backyards, and schools were having nuclear drills. School drills were duck and cover. Duck under your desk and cover your head, because that will totally keep you safe from a nuclear devastation. The first large-scale call ban on using nuclear weapons for mass destruction was by the President of India in 1954. Later on, in 1958, nearly 10,000 scientists presented a petition that pled a stop to nuclear weapon testing to the United Nations Security General, Dag Hammarskjöld. There was eventually discussion of an arms control agreement, such as the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963 and the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons of 1968. Although majority were highly against the use of nuclear weapons due to fear, military strategists felt that the presence of weapons with unparalleled destructive powers had made its own discipline. Nuclear strategy was eventually the product, which led to, of course, Strategic Air Command. Air Force General Curtis LeMay was called back to the U.S. from Germany in 1948 to take charge of Strategic Air Command, better known under its acronym SAC. SAC was created in 1946 to be our primary nuclear defense center with the sole purpose of scaring the Russians, or anyone else for that matter. The logic of SAC was rudimentary. If you destroy us, we will destroy you 10 times over, and in some ways it fit perfectly with LeMay's view of the world. Do not bother anyone, but if bothered, do not be bullied. This idea of mutually assured destruction was a big ideal of SAC. SAC, A History, 2017. Although starting out, SAC wasn't fully put together. Most crews were without the basic training needed for their new missions, and on top of that, most of their planes were unfit to be in combat, let alone fly. In theory, the Strategic Air Command was the logical vehicle to promote U.S. power, but SAC in its infant stages was one shockingly ill-organized, ill-equipped, non-functioning military operation, and everyone in the upper ranks of the Air Force knew it. It is no coincidence that SAC had an appalling accident rate. Worse, nobody seemed to care. In 1947, SAC ran a simulated test. Out of the 180 planes in its command, 101 could not even get off the ground. The best example of SAC's poor start was its even poorer plan of operations. In the event that anything were to happen with the Soviets that would require an attack to be made, all B-29s available would have to fly to Fort Hood, Texas, where the nation's nuclear weapons were stored. Once there, pilots would fill out the necessary paperwork and the bombs would be brought out of their deep lockers and loaded onto the planes. From Texas, they would fly to England or Newfoundland where they would refuel. Only then would they fly off to their targets. The potential for problems was truly nightmarish if a crisis were to strike. It was obvious to LeMay that no one had thought things through. When LeMay took over SAC, he assessed the readiness of the Air Force and was blunt in his appraisal. I should go on record and say this flatly. We didn't have one crew, not one crew in the entire command who could do a professional job to its foundation and completely rebuild it. By 1953, the Strategic Air Command under Curtis LeMay had achieved a massive retaliatory strength. There were 17 nuclear-armed wings, which translated to 329 B-47s, 185 B-36s, 500 tankers, and 200 fighters, as well as the old standby, the B-29, which flew until the early 1960s. A global network of bases, some even built in isolated and barren locations like Greenland and North Africa, had been assembled, all within striking distance of the Soviet Union. In all, there were 29 bases in the States and 10 overseas. Airmen would take their turns in ready rooms, where they would be on alert for 24 hours. The planes just outside the door were hot, meaning they were maintained, fueled, and fully loaded with nuclear arms. The bases were secure. LeMay ended careers if he witnessed any breach in that security. Within just a few years of taking over, Strategic Air Command was a well-oiled and deadly machine, coiled back and ready to spring at any time of day or night.